Chapter 31. The next day in court, Charlotte took the oath with a steady hand. She had rehearsed this part. Gerald had made sure of that. When she sat in the witness box, smoothing her skirt, she kept her gaze fixed just above the jury's heads. Her line of sight was high enough to avoid their eyes and low enough to appear composed. The courtroom settled into attentive silence. Gerald Thornton rose. "Please give your name." "I am Charlotte Blakewell," she responded confidently. "Miss Blakewell," he began, his voice measured, almost sympathetic. "You are Edward Hale's sister?" "Yes." "You were present at the house on the evening of the incident?" "Yes." Gerald took a slow step closer to the jury, though his eyes remained on her. "Can you describe what you saw that day?" She inhaled. "Edward was on the floor. There was blood." A pause. "And Rachael Brown?" "She was standing nearby." Gerald tilted his head slightly. "Doing what, please?" Charlotte hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "Holding a knife." "Was there anything about her demeanor that frightened you?" Charlotte's fingers tightened around one another in her lap. She looked distant, not herself. Gerald nodded faintly, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "In shock?" "Objection, Your Honor. Leading the witness," Emmanuel interjected. The judge raised her hand slightly, but Gerald had already shifted. "At that moment," Gerald continued gently, "when you were alone in the flat with your brother bleeding, how did you feel?" Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it again. She saw Edward's colourless face, the pool of blood on the floor, the knife. "I was terrified," she said finally. Gerald's tone softened further. "Terrified for your brother?" "Yes." "And is that all you feared?" The question was so casually phrased it almost slipped past her. Charlotte hesitated. Gerald waited. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "No," she said at last. "I feared for myself too." Gerald inclined his head, satisfied. "Thank you, Miss Blakewell." He turned to Emmanuel and added, almost arrogantly, "Your witness." Charlotte did not meet Rachael Brown's eyes. Instead, she looked up at her mother in the gallery and caught a small nod of approval. But even that didn't quiet the uneasy feeling coiling inside her that left her with the sense that she had somehow failed Edward and the baby yet to be born. Emmanuel rose slowly. He did not rush her. "Miss Blakewell," he began, his voice calm, almost gentle, "you told the jury that you feared for your life. Is that correct?" Charlotte swallowed. "Yes." "You were standing several meters away from Rachael Brown at the time?" "Yes." "Did she approach you?" "No." "Did she threaten you verbally?" Charlotte hesitated. "No." "Did she raise the weapon toward you?" Her jaw tightened. "No." A pause. Emmanuel let it linger. "So when you say you feared for your life," he continued quietly, "can you explain to the jury what specific action made you believe you were in immediate danger?" Charlotte opened her mouth. Nothing came. She stopped, her throat suddenly dry. "I was in shock. My brother was bleeding. Everything felt dangerous." "Of course," Emmanuel said softly. "Shock can be overwhelming." He let the words settle. "But shock is not the same as threat, is it?" Silence pressed in around her. The courtroom felt suddenly smaller, airless. Emmanuel shifted slightly, then inclined his head. "Thank you. No further questions." Charlotte stepped down from the witness box on legs that felt unfamiliar, as though they no longer quite belonged to her. She did not look at her mother, Gerald, or Rachael. Those who make a person appear to be the offender in a lawsuit, who set a trap for someone who is making his defense in court, and push aside the innocent with specious arguments. Isaiah 29:21. Chapter 32. Emmanuel sat across from Dr. Obi in his private office. Neatly stacked journals lined the shelves, each angled with meticulous precision. A single lamp cast a warm pool of light across the polished mahogany desk, its glow catching the chrome edges of framed certificates displayed behind him. The quiet hum of the air conditioner underlined the room's stillness. It was controlled, orderly, unmistakably the domain of a man who tolerated neither chaos nor speculation. Among his community, Obi was simply known as the Doc. He had been the first in his family to attend university, the first to specialize in psychiatry. Trauma was his field of expertise, and his reputation made him notoriously difficult to book. And to him, Emmanuel King wasn't just any lawyer. Emmanuel had once been his advocate during one of the most difficult periods of his life. Dr. Obi, casually dressed in olive cargo trousers and a black Louis Vuitton shirt, looked nothing like a man who spent his days unpacking the horrors of the human mind. He sat behind the desk, a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage he encountered daily. He poured Emmanuel a glass of water and settled into his chair. Emmanuel wasted no time. "I represent Rachael Brown." Obi didn't flinch. He simply listened. Listening was his discipline. "She's been charged with the manslaughter of Edward Hale." Obi tilted his head slightly. "Yes, I saw that in the news." "I don't think the prosecution's case is as strong as it appears," Emmanuel said. "We're dealing with something deeper, something psychological. I need evidence. I need facts I can present in court." Obi studied him. "Did he ever hurt her before?" Emmanuel shook his head. "No, Edward wasn't like that. He loved her." Obi steepled his fingers. "Then what's the trigger? What pushed her to act?" Emmanuel's expression darkened. "That is what I want you to unravel, Dr. Obi." He exhaled sharply before continuing. "She grew up in poverty, abused by a family friend, trafficked to the UK. Her entire existence has been shaped by violence and exploitation. She was rescued by a charity, rebuilt her life, met Edward. It was a fairy tale until it wasn't. And now she's the villain in the story." Obi leaned back, thoughtful. "Her past is undeniably tragic. Loss, abuse, neglect. But how do you connect that to the moment of the crime?" Emmanuel didn't answer. Obi continued. "Trauma leaves a fingerprint on the mind, but courts don't deal in poetry. They deal in causation." A beat passed. "I need access to her," Obi said finally. "A full psychological assessment. If her history shaped her perception of threat, we may be looking at trauma response, not malice." He paused, then added quietly, "But be prepared for the counterattack." Emmanuel met his gaze. "You should know that Gerald is the least of my worries." A faint hardness entered his voice. "He is fighting a lost war. The Lord helps and delivers them. He rescues and saves them from the wicked because they take refuge in him." Psalm 37:40. Chapter 33. The day was about 18 degrees, the sky a dull, stormy grey. The wind howled ominously, a reminder of Storm Sterling, which had swept across Europe and left destruction in its wake. A storm in summer was an indication of the effects of climate change. Dr. Obi parked his white Ford Explorer between two black Range Rovers, grabbed his bag, and approached the cold, steel grey door of the secure facility. After signing in and receiving his visitor's badge, he was escorted to the visitor's bay. Inside, he placed his notes on the table and waited. He had promised Emmanuel an honest assessment. As he waited, his mind wandered. The media coverage had been merciless. Nigerian-born murderess, gold-digging widow. And to add to all that was the rising political storm. The bill had passed through the House of Commons and was now making its way through the House of Lords. The thought made Obi sick to his stomach. A genocidal bill dressed up as justice. The press had fangs, and they had already sunk deep into Rachael Brown's story. His thoughts were interrupted by the clanging of the door, and Rachael shuffled in with Tom Daniels behind her. Obi rose to his feet and waited for the cuffs to be removed, then introduced himself. "I'm Dr. Obi. Emmanuel hired me for an assessment." Rachael ignored his outstretched hand and lowered herself onto the bolted-down chair across from him. Her eyes were hollow, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked like a woman who had already accepted her fate. Tom left, shutting the metal door behind him. Obi went straight to business. He switched on the recorder app on his phone and spoke into it. "Today is Tuesday, the 5th of July. My name is Dr. Obi, and I am here with Rachael Brown." He met her empty gaze. "Can you state your name for the record?" "Rachael Brown." "How old are you?" 32. "Where were you born?" "Nigeria." Her voice cracked. "How did you get to England?" Rachael stiffened. Her fingers twitched against the metal table. "I was trafficked." He nodded. "Tell me what that means." Her gaze shifted away, as if searching for an escape route. "I was promised a job in social care." She scratched her forehead, looking anywhere but at him. "They gave me a passport." "Then what?" Her voice dropped even lower. "They flew me to Tunisia. I was locked in with 2 other girls in a flat for 2 weeks with barely any food or water." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around themselves. "The flat," she paused, searching for the right words. "It wasn't really a flat, just one room, concrete floor, a window that wouldn't open, the smell, the heat." Rachael sighed as the memories flooded back. "They gave us food every other day, a slice of bread, sometimes a tin of sardines, and water in one small bottle we had to share." She drew a shaky breath. "When they moved us, it was in the middle of the night. They shoved us into a van that already had 5 other girls. We were crammed together. They kept shouting at us to keep our heads down. I remember feeling so fearful." Her eyes clouded, fading into the memory. "The boat, it was worse. Too many people. The waves kept hitting us, like the sea was trying to push us back. We were freezing. I thought we were going to die out there. I really did." She blinked, the tears finally gathering. "When we saw the lights on the Kent coast, people started crying." A pause. The fly that buzzed near Obi's head was the only sound in the room. "And when you got to the UK?" Rachael clamped her mouth shut. Obi could see the battle waging inside her, the instinct to shut down, to lock it away, but he needed her to get it out. "What happened next?" he prodded. She was quiet. He was coming dangerously close to making her talk about things she had long buried in the dark recesses of her mind. She fought hard. She couldn't go there again. She turned her face away for a while. He asked again, gently this time, "What happened when you got here?" She wasn't deaf. She had heard him the first time. Her chest tightened. Then she whispered, "I had to pay them back." A bead of sweat formed at her temple, even though the temperature had dipped. She didn't want to remember the first few years she was in England. She wanted to block them out forever. "How?" Silence. Her chest rose and fell sharply, her fists clenched. "I can't." "Yes, you can. I need to know what you did to pay the traffickers for bringing you to the UK." "I can't," she whimpered again. She scratched the back of her head and squeezed her eyes shut. Tears threatened, but she didn't want them. She wanted him to stop. I did what they told me to do, to pay them. Like what? He gently prodded. They sold me, she screamed. Every day to different men, important men, politicians, businessmen, diplomats, the type you see on TV. I paid the pimps every single day. Get it? Her words trailed off and she went silent. The fly buzzed again. Neither of them moved. Then what? We were rescued by a charity, she said quietly, wanting it to end. What charity? The Women of Mercy. Why didn't you leave before the rescue, Rachel? They killed Honey. Her body was found in the Thames, and justice did not catch up with them. They had the best lawyers. They rubbed it in our faces, and they promised they would do the same to us and every member of our families. We couldn't leave. And if you refused to attend to their requests? To pay? He questioned. It was one thing to leave and another not to comply. She didn't respond immediately. Then slowly she raised her top just below her bosom and said, "This happened to you if you refused." The scar was as ugly as the heart of the person who inflicted it, a patch of skin that looked roasted, warped by cruelty. He turned his face away and almost gagged. Deep breaths helped him continue. For the record, Rachel has shown me deep scars on her stomach, he spoke into the recorder. This was the truth the jury needed to hear. This was what Emmanuel needed to prove. She was driven by fear of her past. But first, he still needed to ask the hardest question of all. Not yet. He recognized the resistance in her posture, the way her body tensed as if bracing for impact. He didn't push, not yet. He knew better than to force a wounded mind into the fire before it was ready. Instead, he eased her into safer waters. "Tell me how you met Edward," he said, his tone lighter, almost conversational. A memory flickered across her face, a brief, fragile smile. "In a cafe," she murmured. "Tell me about that day," he encouraged, offering her a much-needed escape, however temporary. Rachel exhaled, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "I was a waitress. He came in for coffee, and then the next day, and every day after that until I stopped working there." Dr. Obi smiled. "He came in to see you." She nodded, her lips curved upward, a rare moment of warmth. "Yes, and we had been together ever since, until..." Her voice caught, the light dimmed in her eyes. "Tell me about the day of the incident, Rachel. What happened?" She flinched. Her entire body recoiled as if struck. A strangled sob tore from her throat, startling even Obi. "I can't," she cried. Her voice broke. Dr. Obi remained calm. "Why not?" Her head snapped up, eyes wide and haunted. Because... Her heart pounded furiously in her chest, a relentless hammering that felt as though it might shatter her from the inside out. Her breath came in sharp, broken gasps. Her shoulders shook violently. Her pain had no language, only sound. It clawed its way up her throat, tore through her, and escaped in strangled cries that reverberated off the cold walls of the room. It was primal, raw, the kind of sound that only came from a soul utterly shattered from within. It wasn't just grief, it was agony, mourning, self-hatred, guilt, all fused into a single sound. Weeks of suffering compressed into one relentless moment, a storm that had gathered for far too long. She wept again for Edward, for the life he lost, and for their baby without its father. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, and the unbearable truth pressed in with them. It was all her fault. Her body curled into itself as the weight of it all bore down on her, crushing her beneath an avalanche of guilt. She had killed him. with her own hands. The same hands that had once held his face, traced the lines of his palms, rested against his chest. Now those hands were stained. How could the history of her life be rewritten? How could she move forward without him? Her chest heaved as another wave of sobs took hold. Her body convulsed under the weight of it all. Dr. Obi said nothing. He simply sat there, watched and waited. He understood that some wounds needed to bleed before they could begin to heal. He reached for a box of tissues and a bottle of water he carried with him and placed them on the table. She didn't ask for them, but she reached immediately. Her fingers trembled as she twisted off the cap. She gulped down the water. It soothed the dryness in her throat, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. She grabbed a tissue and wiped her face and clothes, erasing the evidence of the breakdown. "We'll take a 10-minute break," Dr. Obi said softly, reaching over to pause the recorder. He felt sorry for her, truly, deeply sorry, but he could not allow that sorrow to blur the lines he needed to keep clear. Emotion, however justified, would not convince a jury. Facts would. Evidence would. And at this point, he didn't yet have everything he needed to present in court as part of her defense. For Rachel's sake, for the promise he had made to Emmanuel, for the debt he would carry for the rest of his life. Because Emmanuel had saved him, he had dragged him back from a precipice most never returned from. Dr. Obi had once sat exactly where Rachel sat now, accused and condemned before he had even opened his mouth. Not because he had committed the monstrous crime laid at his feet, but because someone had made sure the world believed he had. The case had been perfect, too perfect. His fingerprints on the weapon and DNA under her nails. A timeline was constructed with surgical precision. It was so convincing that even he, in his darkest moments, had wondered whether he had lost time, memory, and lost his mind. His wife, his beautiful, brilliant, utterly loyal wife, was taken from this world cruelly, and the world had decided he was responsible. His colleagues had abandoned him, and friends had quickly vanished. Even his family, unsure and frightened, had retreated to a safe emotional distance. The whispers had followed him like shadows. He had been branded a monster before he had ever stepped inside a courtroom. Except Emmanuel. Emmanuel had believed him stubbornly, almost recklessly, perhaps because Emmanuel had seen something in him others had missed, or perhaps because Emmanuel lived by a conviction few dared to hold, that truth, however deeply buried, was always worth unearthing. Piece by painstaking piece, Emmanuel had dismantled the lie. He traced the evidence back to its architect. Truman, a colleague who had smiled in Dr. Obi's face, shaken his hand, shared meals in his home, and hated him with a venom fermented over years of rivalry. Killing Obi directly would have been too simple, too obvious. Instead, he chose a more exquisite cruelty. Take the wife, frame the husband, let him rot in prison. Then, step neatly into the life left behind. It would have worked. It should have worked. But Truman had not counted on Emmanuel. Emmanuel had torn the mask off and exposed the rot beneath the polished facade. He had dragged Dr. Obi back from the edge, almost literally. A debt like that was not one that could be repaid, not truly. And so here he was, helping Rachel because Emmanuel had asked him to. This was because he understood what it meant to be misjudged, misunderstood, mishandled by the justice system. He was helping because he owed Emmanuel more than a lifetime could repay. He looked across a small interview room. Rachel sat slumped in her chair, hollow-eyed, her hands loosely clasped. Her thoughts were far away, lost behind a fog of memory and guilt, imprisoned long before she had ever stepped inside a cell. He couldn't let history repeat itself. With a slow breath, he straightened his shoulders. The truth was in there somewhere. He just needed to find the thread. "Let's continue," he said softly. Then he switched the recorder back on. "Tell me what happened on the day of the incident, Rachel." No response. "Rachel?" he pressed. Nothing. "What happened?" he repeated, his voice firmer now. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips. "I couldn't sleep that night." "Why?" She flung her head back, lips tightening, irritation flashing across her face. "Why couldn't you sleep?" he asked again, gently coaxing her towards the truth. Her jaw clenched. "Because of my nightmares." "What nightmares?" Her fist tightened in her lap. She shook her head. She hated this moment, this conversation, and this place. "The ones about my journey to Europe," she whispered. Dr. Obi stayed silent, letting the space do the work. "The ones about how I had to pay for my trip to England." A pause. Then, "The ones about when I was 14. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Obi nodded, giving her space. "So your past life triggers the nightmares?" "It is not my past, it is my life," she snapped, her voice rising. He raised a hand in reassurance. "Okay, Rachel, this is your life now, not your past. I hear you. Tell me more." She turned to him suddenly, her eyes flashing with anger, exhaustion, and defiance. "Why don't you ask my therapist? He asks me the same questions you're asking now." "What type of questions?" he pressed. "Questions about my nightmares," she muttered. "Tell me about the nightmares, Rachel." A flicker of hesitation, then, "Come on, Doc, let it go," she snapped. Obi held his ground. "I dream of the abuse. I dream of going without food for days. I dream of finally being given a meal, only to have it taken away. I dream, I dream, I dream." Her voice fractured. Then she collapsed into the chair, drained, shattered, broken. She preferred a prison sentence over this conversation, because reliving the truth was traumatizing. Obi remained silent. He gave her a moment. "Tell me about the night of the 25th of May. The room suddenly felt smaller. She was going there. She gripped her fists, clenched her teeth, trying to avoid the scene of the crime. "You have to say what happened," he urged. The knot in her stomach tightened, her throat dried. She reached for the water again, took a gulp, and knew she had no chance of escaping the horrible grasp of his questioning. "I heard a noise," she whispered, as though afraid someone might hear. "What noise?" She ignored him and continued. "I looked everywhere. I called out. No one answered." Her hands shook violently in her lap. "Edward had a habit of surprising me." She swallowed. But this was different. There was no response, and I got scared. "Why were you scared?" he asked quietly. "I was scared they had come back to get me. They wanted me back. I had no right to be happy and free, and I thought they wanted to take all that away from me." Obi stayed perfectly still, his gaze fixed on her. "I thought they had come back for me. I thought they were in the house with me. You know, like true crime, a home invasion. I was scared. I was sure the window was open, even though I had shut it 5 minutes earlier." A heavy silence filled the room. "And then?" Her eyes glossed over. "I grabbed a knife." A single tear slipped down her cheek. Ed came up behind me. Her hands balled into fists. He touched my shoulder. She squeezed her eyes shut. "And I swung round thinking it was them." Her voice shattered. She crumbled, sobbing so violently that the sound barely seemed human, the raw, broken howl of someone reliving the worst moment of their life. For the first time, she had spoken about that night. Obi leaned back. This was a turning point for her healing process. And more importantly, he had the truth Emmanuel needed. See, O Lord, how distressed I am. I am churning within. My heart is pounding within me, for I have been most rebellious. Outside, the sword bereaves. Inside, there is death. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 20. Chapter 34. Rachel lay in her bunk, her body curled into itself, arms wrapped around her stomach as if she could physically hold back the pain that had consumed her since her meeting with the doctor. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, the flash of the knife, the brief look of shock on his face, the crimson blooming against his white shirt like a spreading stain of irreversible fate. She squeezed her eyes shut and willed the memories away, but they only grew louder. Laughter erupted from the common room, crude jokes, clattering cutlery, doors banging. Then a sharp yell. A new inmate was accused of being a snitch. Insults flew, threats were exchanged, and Rachel knew what would come next. She had been here long enough to understand that in places like these, you either stood up for yourself or you suffered the consequences. A shadow filled the doorway before resolving into the familiar shape of Kate Jones. She stepped inside, another inmate trailing close behind, blonde hair, lazy movements, arrogance clinging to her like perfume. "Why are you crying?" The question was pointless, almost insulting. "Not now," Kate snapped, shooting her a sharp look that stopped whatever remark the woman had been about to make. "Not now." Blondie huffed, unimpressed. "I only asked." Rachel wiped her face and pushed herself upright. Her temples throbbed as if her scar had been tightened from the inside. The air felt thick, heavy in her lungs. She blamed it on the doctor. "How are you feeling?" Kate asked gently. The question lingered long after the lights dimmed, long after the wings settled into the uneasy quiet of the night. How was she feeling? If she was honest, she felt frustrated, empty, exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. Tired of crying, tired of the relentless guilt that clung to her no matter how hard she tried to shake it. It followed her into every corner of her mind, every waking moment, a constant reminder of what she had done. She turned onto her side, facing the wall, pressing her cheek into the thin mattress. There had to be a way out of this feeling. She didn't want escape. She wasn't naive, but she needed a way out of the suffocating darkness that wrapped itself around her tighter than the bars ever could. Footsteps echoed down the corridor as guards made their rounds, their presence marked by keys and measured strides. Through the narrow window high above her pod, she caught a glimpse of the moon. It seemed cold, distant, and indifferent to everything that was happening around her. The world was still, everything except her mind. She rose from the bed, her bare feet touching the icy floor. Hands braced at her hips, she paced the small space like a caged animal. Tears slipped silently down her face as her chest tightened, her breath growing shallow. She didn't know if the session with the doctor had made it worse. There was nowhere for the feeling to go, no place to put it. And then it broke free. The sound tore out of her without warning, raw, guttural, so violent it startled her. It took a moment for her to realize it had come from her own throat. It was anguish, stripped of language, the same sound that had escaped her when the doctor forced her to say things she wanted buried forever. It was the cry of something wounded and cornered, a prisoner who had finally reached the end of her strength. "Who is making that noise?" someone groaned from another pod. "Shut up," another voice snapped. A few curses followed. Muttered complaints echoed through the wing. Rachel barely registered them. She stood there shaking, the sound still ringing in her ears, her chest heaving. Her knees gave way and she sank to the floor, the impact barely registering. The words came before thought could stop them, low at first, then breaking free with a desperation that surprised her. "Please, help me, Lord." She bowed forward, her body folding in on itself as sobs shook through her. She had exhausted every other refuge. denial, anger, grief, and none of them had held. Now there was nothing left to brace herself with, only the truth of what she had done, and the weight of carrying it alone. She stayed there until time lost its shape. When she finally moved, her muscles ached as though they had been clenched for hours. She dragged herself onto the bed, limbs heavy, breath shallow. The cell was quiet now, the usual sounds of the prison reduced to distant echoes that no longer pressed against her thoughts. Her eyes fell on the Bible beside her pillow, its cover worn soft with use. It had been on her bed since the day she entered the facility. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and let it fall open. Moonlight slipped through the bars and settled on a single line of text. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." She read it again, slower this time. The words did not erase anything, but they settled something inside her, easing the tight, constant pressure in her chest. She read it once more, and with it came a realization so quiet it almost escaped her. She did not have to hold this alone. She turned the page and stopped again. "He was wounded for our transgressions, and by his stripes we are healed." Her finger traced the verse as though it might anchor her. For the first time, the thought did not feel abstract or unreachable. The Bible slipped from her hands onto the bed. She did not know how long she knelt there afterward. The sounds of the facility, guards' footsteps, coughs, murmurs, faded until there was only her breathing and the steady calm that had taken their place. The ache in her chest softened, replaced by something gentler, something she had not felt in years. "Peace." She bowed her head again. "Dear Lord," she whispered, and this time the words did not fracture. "Thank you." It was surrender. "For you," she whispered, "the one who carries what I cannot." "I give this to you," she said quietly. "All of it, my guilt, my shame, what I did to Edward." Her hands curled into the blanket beneath her, then loosened. "I will face what comes," she continued, "but I won't be crushed by it." The silence that followed was not empty. It held. When she finally lifted her head, her mind was still. The walls and the bars remained. Tomorrow would come, and with it the court proceedings. She knew she was not alone, and for the first time since that night, she was no longer fighting herself. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no stately form or majesty to attract us, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took on our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, struck down and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each one has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And who can recount his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. He was stricken for the transgression of my people. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with a rich man in his death, Although he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and to cause him to suffer. And when his soul is made a guilt offering, he will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After the anguish of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he has poured out his life unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Isaiah 53, 1-12. Chapter 35. Friday morning arrived with the usual electric hum of anticipation. The queue for the public gallery stretched long, an endless line of spectators desperate to witness the next dramatic turn in the trial. The social media evangelists from the previous day had done their work well, which explained the spike in attendance. Online, emotions had reached a fever pitch, but none of that mattered here. This was the only place where justice would be decided. Please rise for the Honourable Judge Olam, the clerk called. The courtroom rose as one. Judge Olam entered, his black robes flowing, his face an impenetrable mask of authority. Settling into his seat, he addressed the defence. We will proceed with the trial. Defence, are you ready to call your next witness? Yes, Your Honour. Defence calls Dr. Kenneth Obi. Obi took the stand, swore the oath, then adjusted his glasses before folding his hands neatly in front of him. Emmanuel approached. Dr. Obi, could you state your full name and profession for the record, please? My name is Dr. Kenneth Obi, and I am a psychiatrist specializing in mental health disorders. Can you tell us about your professional background? I studied medicine at Imperial College London before specialising in psychiatry at the University of Oxford. I have been practicing for over 20 years, focusing on patients suffering from PTSD, schizophrenia, and severe trauma-related conditions. Emmanuel nodded. Thank you, Dr. Obi. Can you share your professional assessment of Rachael Brown? Obi turned slightly towards the jury to command their full attention. Of course, after conducting an extensive interview and psychological evaluation, I diagnosed Miss Brown with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The room fell utterly silent. Even the jurors, some of whom had previously worn masks of detached skepticism, leaned forward ever so slightly to listen. Her PTSD stems from a history of severe trauma, beginning in her teenage years and persisting into adulthood. With her permission, I will share these details. Emmanuel gave a reassuring nod. Dr. Obi took a breath and began. As a teenager, Rachael was sexually abused by a trusted family friend. Shortly thereafter, she was deceived into traveling to the UK under false pretenses. The journey itself was marked by abuse and starvation. Upon arrival, she was subjected to further horrific abuse, both physical and sexual. She was trafficked, controlled, and exploited from the moment she set foot in Kent via a small boat. She was threatened constantly that if she ever escaped, they would come after her and her family. 2 women trafficked by the same organized crime network were used as examples. Their remains were pulled from the Thames, and the pimps made them almost impossible to recognize. He paused. She has physical scars, and they are very grotesque scars. These she got for resisting her captors, For years, she endured unimaginable suffering before being rescued by Women of Mercy, a charity committed to helping trafficked children and women. In the jury box, a middle-aged woman discreetly wiped her eyes. A couple of jurors blinked rapidly, their previous indifferent expressions now deeply troubled. Even some of the men shifted uncomfortably as they absorbed the gravity of what had just been revealed. Emmanuel let the moment breathe before speaking again. Dr. Obi, can you explain the long-term psychological effects of such trauma? The psychiatrist nodded. The long-term effects of prolonged sexual abuse and trafficking are profound, he said calmly. Survivors frequently develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Common symptoms include hypervigilance, dissociation, an exaggerated startle response, and an impaired ability to accurately assess present danger under stress. He paused, allowing the words to settle. In Miss Brown's case, these symptoms presented as an acute fear of recapture, difficulty distinguishing past threat from present safety, and a tendency to freeze or dissociate during moments of perceived danger. Emmanuel leaned forward slightly. Dr. Obi, how would such a condition affect someone in a sudden, high-stress confrontation? A person with complex PTSD, Dr. Obi replied, may react instinctively rather than rationally. Their body responds before conscious thought. Behavior in such moments is often fragmented, defensive, and driven by survival mechanisms formed during earlier trauma. Objection, Your Honor, Gerald Thornton roared. The witness is crossing into speculation. A ripple of tension passed through the courtroom. Judge Olam's gaze shifted from Dr. Obi to Emmanuel and finally settled on Gerald with the faintest flicker of impatience. Mr. Thornton, he said, the witness is entitled to explain the clinical basis for his assessment. He has not asserted a legal conclusion. Gerald's nostrils flared. Objection overruled. Dr. Obi continued undeterred. Ms. Brown has learnt to manage her trauma, but not always successfully. It resurfaces unexpectedly. Fear is her greatest struggle, and it is a very real, consuming fear. His voice lowered, more solemn now. She is haunted by the belief that someone from her past, the men who controlled and profited from her suffering, will return for her. Her medical records confirm this diagnosis. He hesitated before delivering the final, devastating truth. And on the night in question, when Edward tried to surprise her, that fear took over. In her mind, he was not her husband. He was an intruder, a predator, a man sent to hurt her. A long pause. And in that moment of terror, she acted. Silence held the room. She defended herself. Her trauma made her see the ghost of her past rather than the man in front of her. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Some jurors were visibly shaken. The gallery murmured. The weight of the testimony settled like a heavy fog. Even Charlotte looked solemn. Her mother, however, remained unmoved, her expression carved from stone. Emmanuel broke the silence. Thank you, he said warmly. No further questions for now. Judge Olam turned to the Crown Prosecutor. Your witness. Gerald rose and approached the stand. His jaw remained still, but the muscle beneath it twitched, a reflection of the tension simmering beneath his composure. Dr. Obi, Gerald began with controlled calm, thank you for your testimony. He paced slowly, turning briefly towards the jury before returning his gaze to the witness. You've stated that Miss Brown suffers from PTSD due to a history of trauma. That's correct, yes? Yes, Dr. Obi replied evenly. That is correct. And PTSD, as you described, can cause individuals to freeze in moments of extreme stress. That is one possible response. The prosecutor nodded slowly, his expression sharpening. Would you say that PTSD completely removes an individual's ability to act rationally in a stressful situation? Dr. Obi weighed his words carefully. Not completely, but it can significantly impair decision-making in moments of acute stress. A flicker of satisfaction crossed Gerald's face. So, he said, stepping closer to the jury, it's possible that Miss Brown froze when she saw her husband bleeding. I'll give you that. He leaned in slightly, his tone tightening. But afterwards, after the moment of trauma had passed? A beat of silence. Wouldn't choosing not to call 999 suggest something else? Perhaps an attempt to conceal what she had done? Emmanuel's brow furrowed, sensing the shift. Objection, he snapped. Speculation. Judge Olam raised a hand. Overruled. The witness may answer. Jurors shifted in their seats. Dr. Obi exhaled slowly. PTSD can impair judgment, but I cannot speak to her exact reasoning after the event. Gerald seized the opening. So PTSD doesn't absolve her actions afterwards. It doesn't explain failing to seek help while the victim lay bleeding. He turned fully to the jury and drew a steadying breath. I am afraid I cannot speak to her response later. Thank you, Gerald said crisply. No further questions. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Gerald returned to his seat, arms folded loosely and his chin raised slightly. He had the smug look of a man very satisfied with his craft. Rachel's hands trembled in her lap. Gerald Thornton had raised the stakes. Dr. Obi was meant to be their star witness, and she no longer knew how brightly he had shone. I assure you, we tell you what we know and have seen, and yet you won't believe our testimony. John 3:11. Chapter 36. This trial was no longer just about Rachael Brown. It had become something more like a reckoning, a confrontation between justice and the failures of society. She was not simply on trial for taking a life. She had become the voice of every girl, every boy, every man or woman who had been trafficked, abused, and discarded. She was standing in the dock for those who had never been given the chance to stand at all. The news cycle was vicious. Commentators, legal analysts, psychologists, and politicians filled the airwaves, each debating the true meaning of justice in Rachel's case. Was her past responsible for her actions? Were the true perpetrators not the very individuals who groomed, manipulated, and ultimately sold her? On the 9 o'clock news on ITV, an impassioned debate unfolded. Inside Rachel's wing, the women huddled around the television screen and watched as the world dissected the woman they now viewed as both friend and survivor. A grave-faced male anchor turned to the panel of experts. Is her trauma an excuse for her actions, he asked, his voice steady but pointed, or should we hold her accountable as we would anyone else? The debate seemed balanced until Lola Whitfield, a member of the panel because of her role at the Daily Morning Standard, cut through the discussion. Yes, she was trafficked. She turned to her left. Yes, she was pimped. She exhaled sharply, facing the camera. But let's not forget that she still raised her hand against an innocent man. That, she emphasized, is why she is on trial. The newsroom fell silent. In the prison's common room, the women shifted uneasily. Some clenched their fists, others remained deathly still. Lola pressed on. The camera zoomed in as her voice sharpened. If every trafficked girl goes on a killing spree, where does that leave the rest of us? Do we excuse bloodshed because of a troubled past? Justice cannot falter in the face of sympathy. Her words set fire to the airwaves. Don't get me wrong, I feel sympathy for her. But what about Edward? Who feels sympathy for him? Will he get justice? She wrinkled her nose. The facility erupted into argument. Some women shouted at the screen, furious at the indifference. Others looked haunted, seeing pieces of their own stories reflected in Rachel's trial. For every trafficked girl who had never escaped, for every woman shattered under the weight of violence, for every soul failed by the systems that should have protected them, Rachel's trial was their trial too. A battle not just for Rachel's freedom, but for recognition, for justice. Beyond the prison walls, social media did what social media does best. Everyone had an opinion. The world had split in two. One side condemned Rachel as a killer, the other saw her as the ultimate victim of a society that had abandoned her long before she lifted that knife. The next day, Emmanuel arrived early at court. It was his usual routine whenever he was due to deliver a closing statement. The stillness of the empty courtroom helped him gather his thoughts, sharpen his focus, and silence the noise of doubt. He sat alone at the counsel table and stared at his notes, thinking not of strategy or rhetoric, but of Edward, the man who had trusted him with more than a case. He had trusted him with Rachel's life. Emmanuel had promised to fight for her, to give her the best defense the law could offer. That promise weighed heavily now, more than ever. He thought about Rachel, how she had crumbled slowly and silently under the pressure of it all, how the system seemed to sharpen its claws for people like her, people whose pasts were messy, whose stories did not fit neat legal boxes. This was his last chance, one final opportunity to appeal to the 12 strangers who now held her fate in their hands. One more shot at piercing through their assumptions, their biases, and the headlines that had already tried and convicted her in the court of public opinion. The courtroom soon filled with its usual mix, press with their notepads, spectators craning their necks, hungry for drama, and court officers moving with quiet urgency. Rachel sat beside Emmanuel without a word, pale and hollow-eyed. Her movements were sluggish, her frame noticeably thinner. Across the room, the stenographer poised her fingers over the keys, ready. A hush settled as Judge Olam took his seat. His presence shifted the air. In that moment, he was the embodiment of the law, and Emmanuel felt that familiar tug inside him, the reminder that he stood before a force greater than himself. The jury looked on, weary yet alert, the weight of the past days etched into their expressions. They had heard everything, the evidence, the testimonies, the emotion. Now they waited for this last stroke before retiring for deliberations. Emmanuel glanced at Rachel. Her shoulders were hunched, her fingers worrying the edge of her sleeve. Tears glimmered, though she fought them back. The loss of Edward had not eased, it had deepened, rooting itself further into her soul, and the verdict terrified her. He drew in a breath. This was it. He rose slowly, buttoned his jacket, and stepped into the center of the courtroom. As he prepared to speak, his eyes moved once more to Rachel. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the case before you today is extraordinary. This is not just the trial of Rachael Brown, it is an examination of a life shaped by unimaginable suffering, a life that has endured more pain than most of us could ever fathom. He let his words settle. This case demands more than a simple verdict. It requires you to ask a deeper question. Did Rachael Brown truly act with intention, or was she reacting to the culmination of years of torment, fear, and abuse? He paced slightly, then faced the 12 jurors, shutting out the rest of the courtroom. Did Rachael Brown intend to kill her partner, the same man she married days after the incident, the same man whose child she carries? He let the question linger before answering. No, she did not intend to cause Edward any harm. Emmanuel's voice softened. Rachel loved her husband. That is not a defense tactic. That is an undeniable truth. Edward Hale saved her. He gave her a future. He was her best friend. her anchor in a world that had never given her a reason to trust before. He even married her after the incident. His voice hardened slightly. So I ask you again, why would she deliberately kill the man who gave her a second chance at life? What is the motivation? A pause. There is none. 12 pairs of eyes stared back at him. She did not intend the knife for him. There is no evidence of motive. This was a tragic mistake. She was fighting her past, those demons, those words. I will come back for you if you ever leave us. That threat never left her. She believed she was defending herself from an intruder. The courtroom was silent. One could hear a pin drop. Rachel's trauma did not end the night she escaped her captors. It followed her. It lurked in the shadows, distorted reality, poisoned her sense of safety. When Edward moved suddenly, Rachel's mind did not see the man she loved. It saw a monster from her past. He turned fully to the jury, his voice now a plea. So I ask you, can we hold someone fully responsible for an action born from years of unspeakable suffering? Is that justice? If you find Rachael Brown guilty, you do not punish a killer, you punish a victim. He paused, then added, voice low but fierce. Find Rachael Brown not guilty, because she is not guilty. She is a victim of a past that came back to claim her, and we do not condemn victims, we give them mercy. He returned to his seat and placed a gentle hand on Rachel's trembling hands. The defense rested. Gerald rose slowly, gathering the room's attention. This was his moment to finally bring justice for Edward Hale and honor the promise he had made to those who demanded it. The courtroom fell silent as he stepped forward. His footsteps echoed against the floor, the only sound in the room. He paused, scanning the 12 jurors who held Rachael Brown's fate in their hands. We have heard a tragic story, he began. A story of pain, a story of hardship, a story of survival. But today, we are not here to judge Rachael Brown's past. He stepped closer to the jury box, resting his hands on the barrier. You are here to judge her actions. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Gerald remained still. We acknowledge her past, he continued, his voice briefly softening. We do not diminish her suffering. No one is denying that Rachael Brown has endured hardship, but hardship does not erase responsibility. Pain does not justify killing a human being. Trauma does not grant you the right to take a life, a precious life. Gerald turned back to the jury, letting his gaze rest on each of them in turn. The silence deepened, thick with expectation. She did not freeze in fear that night, he began, his voice steady. She did not collapse. She did not try to run. No, she acted. Rachel shifted in her seat, pulling her hands tighter into her lap. Emmanuel did not move. Gerald continued, pacing slowly before the jury box. She picked up a knife. She gripped it tightly. She drove it into the victim's body. And when he fell to the floor, bleeding out, she did not call 999. A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's warning glance. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Instead, she stood there, she watched. As a life drained from Edward Hale's body, she did nothing. He tilted his head slightly. Why? Fear? He gave a slow, dismissive shake of the head. If she was afraid, why didn't she run? Why didn't she lock herself in a room? Why didn't she pick up the phone and call the police? Because she knew exactly what she had done. And now you must decide what to do about it. He strode toward the defense table, his shoes striking sharply against the floor. Rachel didn't look at him. She sat motionless, her fingers interlaced so tightly they blanched. Gerald pointed toward her, his voice rising. Edward Hale is dead. A mother has lost her son. A sister has lost her brother. A family is shattered. An organization is without its leader. This was not self-defense. It was not an accident. She raised her hand against him. Think about that. She attacked him with that knife. And that is all that matters. Domestic violence, plain and simple. The gallery stirred with soft gasps, shifting feet, a cough quickly stifled. Gerald stepped forward again, his voice resonant. We live in a society governed by law, by order, by justice. If we allow excuses to override facts, we fail in our duty. If we let sympathy cloud judgment, we set a dangerous precedent. If we excuse this crime, where do we draw the line? If every person who has suffered hardship is absolved, where does it end? He faced the jury again, eyes blazing. Do we excuse every crime committed by someone with a tragic past? No. Rachael Brown caused this. Her hands took a life, and for that, she must be held accountable. You, the jury, have been entrusted with the responsibility to uphold justice. That is your duty. You do not owe Rachael Brown your pity. He glanced toward Catherine and Charlotte in the gallery. Catherine's eyes were red, her fingers twisted around a damp tissue. Charlotte sat rigid, pale and hollow. You owe Edward Hale, his family and society the justice they deserve, and justice demands that his killer does not walk free. Find Rachael Brown guilty. Gerald held the jury's gaze for a long, weighty moment, the courtroom suspended in stunned silence. Only then did he turn and walk back to his seat, his expression cold, confident, utterly self-satisfied. He had done his job. And whatever strength Rachael had been clinging to felt crushed beneath the weight of his words. Judge Onam adjusted his glasses and looked toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his gaze sweeping over the 12 faces before him. You have heard the arguments, the testimonies, and the evidence presented in this case. It is now your solemn duty to deliberate and reach a verdict. Your task is not an easy one. The responsibility you bear is significant. You are not here to judge the entirety of Rachael Brown's life. You are here to determine one thing, and one thing only: her actions on the night that led to Edward Hale's death. His tone sharpened slightly. The word willfully, as used in these directions, means that an act was committed voluntarily and deliberately, with a specific intent to do something the law forbids. That is the standard you must consider. Your verdict must be unanimous. You must all agree on each charge against the defendant. Your deliberations will remain confidential, and you will never be required to explain your reasoning outside this court. It is your duty to consult with one another and to deliberate honestly and impartially. Each of you must decide the case for yourself, but only after discussing the evidence with your fellow jurors. Do not hesitate to re-examine your views or to change your opinion if you become convinced you are wrong. A brief pause. However, he added, raising a hand slightly, do not surrender your honest convictions simply to reach a verdict or because others disagree with you. Remember, at all times, you are judges of the facts. Your sole objective is to determine whether the prosecution has proved beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the crime charged. You may now retire to deliberate. Rachael clasped her hands together and pressed them against her swollen belly. Her baby. His father was gone, and now she might be taken away too. She blinked back tears. The next time the jury entered that courtroom, her fate would be sealed. The jurors, a mosaic of men and women from different lives, now bound by a single responsibility, rose and filed silently out of the courtroom. As the door swung shut behind them, a hollow silence settled over the room. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Romans 3:14. Chapter 37. The foreman, Lance Jersey, chosen unanimously by the other jurors, stood at the head of the table and surveyed the room. He wanted to go home, back to his wife, children, and his life. The trial had drained him in ways he hadn't expected. A guilty thought lingered at the edge of his mind. A case of this magnitude could land a book deal. People had built careers on less. He pushed the thought away and rolled up his sleeves. "Right," he said, clearing his throat. "We all know why we're here. We have a duty to decide whether Rachael Brown is guilty or not based on the burden of proof." He paused, scanning the faces around the table. "Let's start with the facts. First question, motive." A middle-aged man leaned forward, frowning. "Her past is heartbreaking, no doubt about that," he said. "But does it excuse what she did? She admitted she killed her husband. Isn't that enough?" A young woman shook her head immediately. "But the trauma." The older juror cut in gently, but firmly. "I'm not dismissing it, but can trauma justify manslaughter?" Across the table, James Patterson shifted in his seat. He rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. Iraq had carved something permanent into his voice. "PTSD is real," he said quietly. The psychiatrist made that clear. People don't always know what they're doing in moments like that. Juror number 9 sighed, conflicted. "But she didn't call 999. The words lingered in the air like smoke. Lance seized on them. "Exactly," he said, nodding slowly. "If it was an accident, why not call for help once she realized?" The room began to divide. Two camps emerged almost naturally. Those who believed the Crown's case that Rachael's actions were deliberate, and those who believed that trauma had hijacked her instincts. Voices rose, hands gestured, chairs scraped against the floor. Hyatt Johnson, a recently retired fintech CEO, finally spoke. He had been quiet until now, absorbing everything. He rubbed his temples before looking up. "Let's slow down," he said firmly. "This is someone's life. We cannot get this wrong." The room stilled. Even Lance felt it, because Hyatt was right. If they convicted the wrong person, they would carry that decision for the rest of their lives. Lance exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he muttered. "We do this properly, witness by witness." A murmur of agreement spread around the table. Some leaned forward, ready to dissect every detail. Others slumped back in frustration, clearly eager to vote and be done with it. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours blurred into days. Arguments flared, voices cracked, tempers rose and cooled again. Some jurors changed their minds, others refused to budge. By the third day, one truth had settled heavily over them all. This was not simple. A woman's life hung in the balance. A man's life had already been lost, and none of them wanted guilt staining their conscience. A younger juror tapped her pen nervously against the table. "The law says they have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt," she said quietly. She looked at Lance. "If even one of us has doubt, we can't convict." Silence fell. Lance glanced at the clock on the wall. The ticking suddenly felt louder than it should. He swallowed. "Can we vote?" No one objected. One by one, hands were raised. The decision formed slowly, reluctantly, almost like something none of them truly wanted to own. Lance's throat tightened. Then, with a deep breath, he reached forward and pressed the buzzer. They had reached a verdict. Meanwhile, back in Stonebridge Remand Centre, Rachael waited. The common room hummed with low noise, but it all felt distant, muted, as if she were listening from underwater. Then she felt arms wrap around her. It was warm and steady. "Don't worry." She knew the voice instantly. Kate Jones, the closest thing she had to a sister in this place. "You are not guilty," Kate said firmly. "Your past is guilty, not you, and the jury will see that." Rachael let out a shaky breath. "I'll be the one to walk you out of here," Kate added. "I promise." Rachel nodded, but words wouldn't come. She hadn't expected kindness here. She had entered these walls alone, grieving and accused, and yet now she had people that she considered as comrades, friends, and something dangerously close to family. "Thank you," she whispered. The women began to drift apart. Then the television in the corner flickered. Breaking news! The room froze as a screen filled with an image of the Houses of Parliament. A grave-looking news anchor spoke in clipped, urgent tones. In a shocking development, Parliament is now debating a bill proposing capital punishment for illegal immigrants convicted of serious crimes in the United Kingdom. A Cameroonian woman gasped. "Are they serious?" "That's not possible," someone whispered. "Not here." The broadcast continued. The bill has passed its second reading in the House of Commons and is now moving to the House of Lords. "How is this happening?" Kate demanded, her voice rising. Across the room, Taryn, a poised, sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, folded her arms tightly. "Why would they even discuss this?" she asked quietly. "It won't pass," Kate said quickly. Too quickly. "It can't." But fear had already entered the room. Then someone whispered the words that changed everything. "It's already past the Commons." A ripple of panic swept through the women. "They wouldn't bring back the death penalty," someone muttered. "Not in this country." But Taryn kept staring at the screen. "Then why is it still moving?" she asked. Rachel felt something drop inside her. A void opened beneath her ribs. She wasn't just fighting a conviction anymore. She was fighting for her life. If the jury found her guilty and this bill became law, prison would not be the end. It would be the beginning of something far worse. Her knees weakened. Kate grabbed her arm. "Don't panic," she said quickly. "This is politics. It'll die in the Lords. The king would never sign something like that." But the room didn't believe her. The broadcast shifted to a parliamentary debate. The Prime Minister appeared on screen, arguing fiercely against the bill. Then the opposition. A black African woman, raised in South Africa, speaking with fire and conviction. "We must protect our citizens. We cannot allow those who enter this country illegally to take innocent lives. Capital punishment is the only true deterrent." A chill swept through the room. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "They're serious." Then a voice cut through the silence, calm, unapologetic. "I think it's a brilliant idea." Every head snapped toward the speaker. A woman from the Midlands stood with her arms folded. "What?" Kate demanded. "We don't want criminals harming our citizens," she said coolly. "I'll sleep better when illegal murderers are held accountable." "You're a racist," someone spat. She shrugged. "It's the will of the people." The argument erupted around them, voices rising, anger colliding with fear. But Rachel heard none of it. All she could hear was the television and the sound of her own heartbeat. It had passed the Commons. It was heading to the Lords. Her trial was ending. The verdict was coming. And suddenly she could see it vividly, horribly, as if it had already happened. A newspaper front page, her face staring back at the world, a headline in merciless black ink. "Rachael Brown, first to hang under the new law." Her breath caught as her hands flew to her stomach. Her baby. Would they take her child from her arms before she even had the chance to hold it? Would her baby grow up an orphan? "No." Her voice cracked, barely audible. "I know I did it." The room quieted. A few women turned toward her. "But I didn't mean to." The words broke something open inside her. The television kept talking, but all she could hear was blood roaring in her ears. Then a guard appeared at the doorway. "Rachael Brown." She looked up slowly. "The jury has reached a verdict. You're due back in court tomorrow morning." The words landed like a sentence. Yesterday she had been fighting for a not guilty verdict. Now she was fighting for something far more terrifying. Her life. Because if the jury found her guilty and the law changed, no judge, no lawyer, no mercy would be enough to save her. O Lord, hear my prayer. In your faithfulness, give ear to my plea. In your righteousness, answer me. Psalm 143, verse 1. Chapter 38. The court finally settled. The long-awaited verdict was minutes away. Some had called it the trial of the century. Others whispered it was really the trial of the victim. Whatever labels the public had thrown at it, one fact remained. 12 strangers from different backgrounds, beliefs, and lives would now deliver the verdict. They had spent days walking the same path, hearing the same evidence, united only by the burden placed upon them. And now they would determine whether she was guilty of killing the love of her life or simply a tragic victim of circumstance. Rachel sat motionless at the defense table, a tremor rising slowly from her stomach to her throat. Her fingers drifted instinctively to her belly, pressing gently against the curve that protected the only piece of Edward she had left. Its father was gone by her own hand, and now this child, who had not yet taken its first breath, stood on the edge of losing its mother too. Her pulse pounded in her ears. What kind of life awaits this child if I am convicted? She blinked rapidly and forced the thought away. She could not afford to spiral. All she could do was wait for the verdict of the 12 people who now held her life in their hands. The bailiff stepped forward. May the defendant please rise. Her legs trembled as she pushed herself upright, Emmanuel rising beside her. She was too afraid to look at the jury, too afraid to look at Edward's family in the gallery, their eyes boring into her. All she could do was stand there and wait for the words that would divide her life into before and after. The judge turned his gaze towards the jury. Lance's Adam's apple bobbed as he stood. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Olam asked. Lance nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, we have. The room fell into complete stillness. Everyone held their breath. Even the bailiff, usually detached, seemed drawn into the gravity of the moment. The judge gave a small nod. What say you in the case of the Crown versus Rachael Brown? Lance Jersey took a deep breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the jury box. A long, torturous, and endless pause followed. Then he spoke. On the charge of involuntary manslaughter, we, the jury, find the defendant, Rachael Brown. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second, but to Rachel it stretched into eternity. Guilty. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Catherine Hale burst into tears, clutching her chest as though justice itself had reached out and touched her. Charlotte turned away, her hands trembling. Gerald eased back into his chair, tension leaving his shoulders in a quiet exhale, the faintest trace of satisfaction flickering across his face before he masked it. A broken sob tore from Rachel before she could stop it. Her knees buckled and Emmanuel caught her before she collapsed. Her body shook violently, racked with grief so deep that she could barely remain upright. She had hoped, somewhere deep inside, she had allowed herself one fragile belief that redemption might still be possible. She had prayed and felt peace, real peace, but now it felt shattered in her hands. She had believed they might see her truth, might understand she had never meant to kill him, might see the woman behind the crime. But none of it mattered now. Only one word remained. Guilty. Emmanuel tightened his grip on her shoulders, his voice barely a whisper. Breathe, Rachel. Breathe. But she couldn't. She was drowning, suffocating beneath the weight of a future she no longer controlled. The hangman's shadow loomed over her and over the fragile life growing inside her. The judge raised his hand. Order, he commanded, his voice steady. But nothing felt ordered anymore. When the gavel finally fell and the session ended, the heavy doors creaked open and the outside world rushed in. Heat, noise, chaos. The streets beyond the courthouse had become a different kind of battlefield. Reporters and protesters swarmed the pavement, their chants merging into a frenzied roar as cameras flashed in blinding bursts, turning the world into a staccato blur. Some in the crowd cheered what they saw as justice served, placards lifted above the sea of faces, and on them, in bold, unforgiving letters, was a single word: guilty, 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 another voice shouted. An eye for an eye. Others erupted in outrage, condemning the legal system for failing to recognize trauma survivors. To some, she was a killer. To others, a victim of a broken system. And Rachel felt abandoned by God, completely, unbearably abandoned. She understood the verdict, but where was God in all of this? She was led back to Stonebridge, away from the media storm, the questions, the flashes, the placards burning with rage. Hours later, she sat once more across from Emmanuel to talk about what came next. She barely felt her body beneath her, as though she had been hollowed out and left empty. Guilty. The word lodged itself deep in her mind, repeating over and over, cutting each time it echoed back. Guilty, guilty, guilty. A curse she could not outrun, heavier than the shackles on her wrists. It did not matter that the truth lay tangled somewhere far beyond what the jury could see. The word had been spoken. Now she had to live with it. The determination of your guilt is not the end, Rachel. It is the beginning of your redemption, Emmanuel said quietly. She blinked through the haze as he tightened his grip on her hands. There is hope for everyone who is guilty. There is a way out. You still have options. A shaky breath escaped her lips, and they will be presented in court. Her hands trembled as she wiped her tear-streaked face, but Emmanuel's voice remained firm, insistent. It is not the end, he stressed. You have to believe that even now, all things are possible. She had thought the trial was the end, that the world had already written her obituary. It could still mean the end of her life, especially with a new bill circling Parliament like a tightening noose. But maybe it was not too late. Salvation did not come before the fall. It came after, in the wreckage, in the ruins, where a person faced the only real choice: rebuild or be buried beneath what they had done. Long after Emmanuel left, his words settled deep in her chest, filling the emptiness with something unfamiliar. She was guilty of thrusting the knife, guilty of surrendering to a past that had stalked her from the shadows. But she was not beyond redemption, at least not in the eyes of the man who had believed in her until his final breath. The press, however, had no space for grace. Their verdict was swift, merciless, and relentless. The evening bulletins rolled across every major channel, her name splashed across tickers and headlines. Amy White, the same anchor who had first reported the stabbing months earlier, spoke again, her crisp delivery slicing into living rooms across the country. It's just reaching us that Rachael Brown, of Nigerian heritage, has been found guilty of the manslaughter of media mogul Edward Hale. The words carried a finality that left no room for nuance. She recounted the grisly details, the emergency call, the failed surgery, as footage of the Hale mansion and an old smiling photograph of Edward filled the screen. Then, without pause, the broadcast pivoted. And in other news, Amy continued smoothly, we are receiving reports tonight of a scandal gripping Westminster. A video circulating on social media appears to show Conservative MP Jack Smith in a compromising moment with Amanda Hughes, the wife of the current Minister of Justice. The screen lit with grainy stills, footage from an influencer's live stream, originally meant to review a Soho restaurant. In the background, Jack Smith walked past hand in hand with Amanda Hughes. Seconds later, unaware of the camera, they paused beneath a neon sign and kissed. That brief moment, caught on a shaky smartphone feed, ignited the internet within hours. Clips were shared and dissected. Social media exploded with hashtags like Justice Affair, Jack and Amanda, Minister's Wife. Memes spread like wildfire. Commentators filled YouTube and late-night panels, speculating about the minister's future, Smith's career, and a government already wobbling under pressure. The scandal devoured everything. News cycles pivoted instantly. Public attention moved with ruthless speed. Oscar Dupont, the investigator hired by Jack Smith, watched the broadcast from the corner of a pub, pint frozen halfway to his lips. By morning, this would be the only story anyone cared about. It was explosive, scandalous, political gold. Compared to this, his client's request to dig dirt on Jonathan vanished into irrelevance. Worse, it rebounded like a bad joke. Did Jack not know that people in glass houses should never throw stones? He exhaled through his nose, almost laughing, and reminded himself he had at least taken payment up front. Something told him Jack would not be needing his services again. Outside, the city buzzed with scandal, the air thick with whispers and speculation. Inside Stonebridge, Rachel sat in silence, her name already slipping down the headlines, eclipsed by Westminster's newest fall from grace. My God, why have you abandoned me? I have cried desperately for help, but still it does not come. Psalm 22, verse 1. Chapter 39. Jonathan Blakewell reached for his summer jacket from the black metal freestanding coat rack, already dressed for the forecasted rain. He wore black boots, corduroy trousers, and a Ralph Lauren polo shirt before stepping out into the crisp, late afternoon air. It was Friday at 3, and the office had begun its slow retreat into the weekend. Only a few diehards remained, hunched over desks, pretending to be productive. Outside, the city pulsed with familiar rhythms, parents racing to collect children, elderly pensioners navigating pavements before the rush hour crush, and young professionals already shedding corporate skins for the flashing lights of the city's clubs. It was the same scene every Friday evening, but Jonathan was in no rush. His meeting was at 6. Plenty of time for a leisurely walk past Parliament before his rendezvous. Tonight was crucial. They had successfully lobbied 2/3 of Parliament to push the bill forward, capital punishment for illegal immigrants convicted of violent crimes. The bill was within reach. Most of the votes were secured, but not all. It was now at its third reading in the House of Commons, and they had come too far to stumble at the final hurdle. If it passed, Jonathan knew the hell's wealth would make a decisive U-turn straight into his hands. A few key politicians still stood in the way, like Kwame Mensah, who he believed was chief among them. A second-generation immigrant with first-generation immigrant parents, Kwame's loyalty to his roots could prove dangerous. He championed controlled immigration, preached rehabilitation over retribution, and wore his faith visibly. If he opposed the bill, others might follow. Kwame carried influence. Everyone had a price. Everyone had a weakness. Kwame, it seemed, had long harbored ambitions of joining the cabinet, twice overlooked, twice forced to swallow pride. That hunger for power might be the crack Jonathan needed. A ministerial post dangled at the right moment could be bait enough. This was politicking. If the bill passed and the dirt surfaced, the current Prime Minister would step down, triggering a reshuffle. Mensah could be elevated, rewarded, transformed into an ally. Would he take the bait? Perhaps. Jonathan turned off Oxford Street onto St. John's Road, passing boutiques, galleries, and cafes overflowing with Friday crowds. London thrived on indulgence, a city where excess stitched itself into every pavement and window display. Traffic snarled in restless waves, buses exhaling fumes, taxis honking in irritation, cars inching forward like stubborn animals. He took a sharp right onto Harriet Road and slipped into the Turkish restaurant. It had become a regular meeting spot. discreet, luxurious, fiercely loyal to its clientele. An exclusive hideout for politicians, not unlike K Street in Washington. The maitre d' guided him to the bar, where he ordered a glass of wine and savoured a few quiet moments before the others arrived. His phone buzzed. Jack Smith, Kwame Mensah, and Fraser Mont were delayed by an incident on the Central Line. The delay gave him time to think about Rachael Brown. Her execution would be the first of many, a precedent. Once the public was conditioned, the rest would follow. The bill would glide through on the back of fear and outrage. At exactly 6:10 p.m., the restaurant door swung open and a small wave of politicians spilled inside. Jack Smith mouthed an apology as staff ushered them toward a private table. Moments later, Kwame Mensah and Fraser Mont joined them. Banter flowed easily at first. Headlines, scandals, and backroom deals tossed around like scraps of meat to a pack of hungry wolves. Bills and contracts were dissected between bites of lamb skewers and chips, washed down between bottles of beer. Gossip slowly hardened into strategy. Then Jonathan made his move. "This bill, we need to secure our country from foreign criminals. What are your thoughts?" Silence followed. Jack Smith waited for Kwame to speak first. Fraser Mont simply watched. Kwame chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Capital punishment," he scoffed. "That's a bit extreme, isn't it?" Jonathan studied him carefully. Kwame was not easy to rattle. He had the pedigree, Eton, Oxford PPE, the immigrant success story wrapped in Tory blue. A difficult man to corner. "It makes my skin crawl," Kwame continued, setting down his wine glass. "We want to hang immigrants while imprisoning British citizens for the same crimes? Does that seem just to you?" He was pushing back. Jonathan expected resistance, but he also knew how to dismantle it. "It's not extreme," he countered. "It's justice. Edward Hale was one of our finest, killed in his own home by an immigrant who was found guilty. And you think we're going too far?" Jack Smith shifted in his seat, the ambition for number 10 flickering behind his eyes. He needed most of them aligned. Jonathan pressed on. "What about Jack Bauer, Jim Hastings, Chloe O'Brien, stabbed, run down, poisoned, and their killers walk free within 5 years?" He stressed 5 years as though the number itself were the bill's justification. A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. "Their lives were taken," Jonathan continued, voice low and persuasive. "Yet their killers will see daylight again. They will marry, have children, and buy neat houses in the suburbs. Is this fair to you?" Kwame wasn't backing down. "Has capital punishment ever stopped home invasions in places like America?" he asked calmly. "Has it ended mass shootings in schools? Has it deterred violent crime anywhere it is practiced?" He leaned forward, meeting Jonathan's gaze head on. "The answer is no. It has done nothing to stop these atrocities. So tell me, why should we introduce it to Britain now?" The tension thickened. A ginger-haired waiter, barely 20, approached hesitantly and cleared his throat. "Are you all okay? Do you need anything else?" Silence swallowed the room. Jonathan turned his head slowly and fixed the young man with a look that made the air colder. Wrong question, wrong time. Someone shook their head. The waiter seized his exit and vanished behind the bar, relief written plainly across his face. Jonathan exhaled and chose his words carefully. "We would lose the point of this bill if it were not applied correctly," he said evenly. "When capital punishment applies to everyone, it loses its edge. But when it is targeted, when it sends a message to those who come here and bring violence with them, it becomes a deterrent." He lifted his gaze deliberately. "Not because it reforms them," he paused, then added with quiet emphasis, "but because it warns the rest." He let the words settle before delivering the emotional hook. "And in doing so, we protect our children, our wives, and the sons this country cannot afford to lose." Kwame rubbed his temple slowly. "You really think this will go to law?" he asked. Jack Smith and Jonathan nodded, almost in unison. Jonathan smiled. "The mood of the country is with us on this one," he assured him. He was blinded by his own ambition now, seeing only headlines, outrage, polling numbers tilting in their favor, and Rachael conveniently convicted and removed from the equation. Jack Smith finally spoke. "Let the debate run its course." "Yes," Kwame echoed. There was sharpness crept into his tone. "Let it run its course." Jonathan's fingers tapped lightly against his glass. "Fine, but when the time comes, which way will you lean? How will you vote?" The room tightened into silence. Two were firmly in favor. Fraser Mont remained unreadable. Kwame only shrugged. "Let it run its course," he repeated. It was clear now. Kwame Mensah remained the obstacle. But obstacles, Jonathan knew, could be moved. Persuasion had many forms, and with enough time and the right leverage, even principled men could bend. For now, Kwame stood alone, though it was impossible to know how many others might quietly follow his lead. That uncertainty made him dangerous. Still, the numbers favored them, for now. Votes shifted, loyalties softened, momentum was everything. They would need to stay disciplined and invest more effort into securing Kwame's vote, along with the MPs likely to move with him. But Kwame was not Jonathan's blind spot. The cords of Sheol surrounded me, and the snares of death stood before me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. I cried out to my God, and from his temple he heard my voice. My cry for help reached his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled, and the foundations of heaven quaked and were shaken because he was angry. 2 Samuel 22, 5-8. Chapter 40. Fraser Mont came from a middle-class background and had entered politics because he was tired of how the country was run. The capital punishment bill unsettled him in a way he couldn't easily articulate. It reeked of injustice, discrimination, and systematic decay on a fundamental level. To the public, Fraser looked every inch the modern politician. Sharp suits, polished speeches, a carefully curated image. He carried the charm of a seasoned statesman and the strategic mind of a chess grandmaster. Yet, beneath the rehearsed smiles and parliamentary debates, Fraser Mont was a man on a mission most of his colleagues would never suspect or understand. Unlike the career politicians surrounding him, Fraser hadn't entered politics for power or prestige. He didn't come from aristocracy or old money. He wasn't groomed from childhood to climb Westminster's ranks. He had forced his way in, not for ambition, but for those who had never been heard. What most people didn't know was why justice mattered so deeply to him. At 15, he had witnessed something that never stopped haunting him. His best friend, Dylan Maseko, a black teenager from a working-class family in Tottenham, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The police needed a suspect, and Dylan became their scapegoat. Fraser had been there that day. He had tried to speak up, tried to tell the truth. No one listened. He watched as Dylan's life was dismantled piece by piece. A trial built on fabricated evidence, a judge who showed no interest in truth, and a defense lawyer who barely fought. Dylan was sentenced to 15 years. He didn't survive 5. Fraser carried that weight into adulthood. He made himself a promise that day. He would never again stand by while the system crushed an innocent person if he could help it. That was why he entered politics. Not for status, not for influence, but for Dylan. What most people failed to realize was that Fraser Mont had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. He had spent years studying the machinery that destroyed his friend. Now he was inside it, watching, learning, waiting, determined to expose the rot from within. Westminster had quietened for the evening. The usual swarm of aides, MPs, and reporters had thinned to a trickle. Fraser sat alone in his office, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, his desk littered with documents, case files, and press clippings. The fluorescent light flickered faintly overhead, but he barely noticed. His focus was fixed on the laptop in front of him and the email that had landed in his inbox an hour earlier, sent from an anonymous source. Fraser understood Jonathan Blakewell, but this was something else. He scrolled through the document, his stomach tightening as the implications unfolded. Suddenly, Blakewell's connection to Rachael Brown made sense. Fraser dragged a hand across his face, frustration tightening his jaw. This wasn't politics, it was corruption. Cold, calculated corruption. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, thoughts racing. Now he understood why Blakewell was pushing the bill so aggressively. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, just past 5. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier with what he knew. Fraser reached for his iPhone, hesitated only briefly, then dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A journalist, one of the few people he still trusted. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. Psalm 110, verse 5. Chapter 41. It was almost 5 p.m. when David Broccoli glanced at the pile of files stacked haphazardly across his cluttered desk. He had moved on from the Daily Morning Standard. The decision had been simple in the end. He knew he wouldn't enjoy working there if Lola Whitfield remained, so he resigned 1 month after their final meeting in the conference room. His new desk was a graveyard of assignments he had no interest in. Rewrites, puff pieces, backgrounders better suited to an intern or someone on probation. Among the mess sat 2 stained mugs, one from weeks ago, the other from the day before, now ringed into the veneer like coffee-coloured bruises. The sight irritated him more than necessary. His eyes drifted to a framed photograph of his daughter, 6 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, smiling beside their German shepherd, the dog leaning into her with unquestioning loyalty. The second photo beside it showed the 2 of them in the back garden, mid-laughter, sunlit and alive. Those pictures were anchors and reminders of what actually mattered. He exhaled and turned back to the files, determined to make use of the brief lull ahead. Once his break ended, 2 meetings waited, one to tidy up a mediocre story, the other with a so-called source looking to cash in. He let out a dry chuckle. In journalism, source was a loaded word. Half the time, it meant someone who wanted to stay out of court while profiting from scandal. He picked up his sandwich and took a bite. Chicken and herb mayo. Not bad, but his appetite felt distant. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again, longer this time, from an unknown number. Curiosity won. This better be good, he muttered, mouth half full. It is, a voice replied evenly. Meet me at the tavern tonight, 8 sharp. This one will break headlines. David blinked. And who exactly is this? A friend from Parliament. The line went dead. He stared at the phone, sandwich forgotten. The last time a call like this had come in, it had led to the exposé on the Surrey MP, the same man who had enforced lockdown compliance while secretly breaking his own rules. That story had rattled the press, Parliament, and his sanity. A PR machine had tried to destroy him afterwards, but the public had seen through it. He wiped his fingers, stood, and strode past the secretary, a woman who seemed to know everyone's secrets before they did, and stopped outside a door marked by a worn white plastic plaque. Head of Editorial, Tom Gray. He knocked. Come in. Tom looked up from his MacBook. Elegant furnishings, plush carpet, stacks of old Guardian editions piled like archaeological layers of journalism. This was his sanctum. Hey David, he said, gesturing him inside. David dropped into the leather armchair opposite him. I just got a phone call. Tom raised an eyebrow but stayed silent. Phone calls were a journalist's currency. They didn't give a name, just said they were a friend from Parliament, told me to meet them tonight, tavern, 8 p.m. Tom leaned back. Could be nothing, could be something. What's your gut saying? I don't know, it sounded serious. Everything in Parliament sounds serious until it isn't, Tom replied dryly. What's hot in the Commons right now? David shrugged. There was talk of a leadership challenge against the Prime Minister, but that's faded since Jack Smith got caught with his pants down. With the Justice Minister's wife, Tom added, tapping his fingers. We listen and we don't judge, David said with a faint grin. Tom ignored it. Anything policy-wise? There's the Immigration Capital Punishment Bill, but it's too extreme, don't you think? Tom's expression hardened slightly. Brexit wasn't supposed to happen either. If this is about that bill, we listen. David hesitated. It's too early to tell. Then go, Tom said simply. Just don't be reckless. David nodded, thanked him and returned to his desk. He tidied instinctively, a ritual to calm his nerves whenever something big loomed. Then he called his daughter. Sweetheart, I won't be home early. Look after Gran, okay? Okay, Dad. Love you. It was 6 p.m. He decided to leave early. An hour later, he threaded through Bond Street crowds and caught the headlines screaming from an Evening Standard kiosk. Rachael Brown found guilty. He thought briefly of Lola and knew she would be celebrating. By 6:45 p.m., David stood before the unmarked oak door of the tavern. It was so discreet it could have been mistaken for the rear entrance of an abandoned townhouse. Inside, however, was another world. Velvet-lined exclusivity swallowed its guests whole. The lighting was low, golden, indulgent. Lamps glowed softly atop marble tables, while shadows clung to dark mahogany paneling like expensive fabric. The air carried the scent of aged wine, slow roasted meat and polished wood, rich enough to taste. A hostess appeared from behind a carved partition, pale and angular, almost otherworldly. Jet black hair fell in a pin-straight sheet to her waist, framing a face reminiscent of Cher. Her long, lacquered obsidian nails tapped rhythmically against a parchment-toned reservation book. Without looking up, she asked, "Name?" David gave it. "You're expected," the hostess said, gesturing for David to follow. They moved past clusters of diners, bent over low conversations, until she stopped at a secluded corner, screened off from the rest of the room. A man was already seated there, tall, wiry, dressed in a polo shirt, sunglasses still on despite the dim lighting. His cap was pulled low, shadowing his face. They quickly ordered a triple burger for the gentleman and steak and chips for David. The moment the waitress was out of earshot, the air shifted. "What you hear doesn't come back to me," the man said quietly. "You're protected," David replied. "Code of silence, always." The man adjusted his nightcap. "Jonathan Blakewell. He's behind the capital punishment bill." David leaned back slightly. "Okay, and?" "He's related to Rachael Brown." "How?" "Married to her sister-in-law." David frowned. "So?" "Think legacy," the man said. "Rachel's married to Edward Hale. Everything goes to her and the baby." "And if she's executed?" "Jonathan's wife and kids become next in line." "But there's a baby," David pressed. The man shrugged. "Guardianship, access, influence, money still flows." David sat back slowly, the shape of it forming. "He's doing this for the inheritance." "For legacy," the man corrected. David nodded. "I know Blake well. Never in the headlines, but always nearby. He's dangerous." He's using public fear to push a policy that benefits him, David muttered. The man gave a grim smile. You're catching on. Later that night, the claims were corroborated by a recording from another anonymous source. It was a private conversation between Jonathan, Charlotte, and Catherine. Listening to it in the dark, David felt the shift from suspicion to certainty. This wasn't theory anymore, it was motive. In the early hours of the morning, running on 2 hours of sleep and 3 cups of coffee, he drafted the piece, The Hidden Hand Behind the Gallows Bill. By noon, he was back in Tom's office. Tom read the article in silence, fingers steepled. Keep it opinion, he said finally, not accusation. Stir the hornet's nest. Let Parliament react. By sunset, the story had taken on a life of its own. At first, it moved quietly, with backbenchers sharing it in private WhatsApp groups. Then, a senior MP retweeted it with a single line, an uncomfortable read. That was enough. Within an hour, #GallowsBill trended. Clips of the article spread across TikTok and X, read aloud, paused, dissected. Amateur legal analysts appeared overnight. Conspiracy threads multiplied. By 9 that evening, producers were scrambling. MPs were hauled onto Newsnight, BBC Politics Live, and Sky News, forced to answer questions they clearly hadn't prepared for. Questions that began with, "Are you aware of the allegation?" and ended with, "If so, why wasn't this disclosed?" The headlines sharpened by the hour. Is capital punishment being used to settle family inheritances? By morning, silence was impossible. Within 72 hours, the bill was quietly withdrawn, pending further review. In her stately home, Catherine Hale slammed the newspaper onto the marble counter. This is a smear. She turned to Jonathan. So, what now? Jonathan exhaled slowly, voice measured. We go quiet. Politically, we've lost traction. So she gets away with what she did to my son, Catherine spat. She is guilty, he replied flatly, already recalculating. Charlotte said nothing, but the exchange lingered with her long after the words faded. Even at dinner that night, she felt distant, watching Jonathan more than speaking. A quiet unease crept in, a sense that something larger had shifted beneath the surface. Then, suddenly, the pieces aligned. Her mother had been blinded by vengeance. She hadn't seen the greater danger sitting at the table. Charlotte was married to a monster. Her eyes narrowed. What? Jonathan asked sharply, sensing it. I am your ticket, aren't I? She murmured. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. The charm fractured and revealed something colder, ruthless, and predatory beneath the surface. It lasted only a heartbeat before smoothing over again, but it was enough. She had seen him, but only now did she realize she hadn't fully known this part of him. It had remained well hidden in plain sight. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, irritation flashing. My ticket to what? Charlotte smiled faintly, though her pulse thundered. Truth, she realized, didn't just sting, it scorched. But she welcomed the burn. She said nothing more. Instead, she watched him a moment longer, as though committing his face to memory. Charlotte, he frowned. She stood and walked past him. Her shoulder brushed his arm lightly. He stiffened, braced for confrontation. None came. At the door, she paused only long enough to breathe. When she opened it, the ordinary sounds of the house rushed in, indifferent and unchanged. Jonathan remained at the table, words arriving too late. The door closed. He sat alone as the silence stretched, and with slow, dawning certainty, he realized he had lost something far more significant than her trust. He had lost control. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. Psalm 110, verse 5. Chapter 42. Court was in session. At the front, Judge Olam sat, his expression grave beneath the traditional white wig, his eyes sharp. The gallery was packed. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, pens poised, scanning for the smallest flicker of emotion. Notes were whispered to assistants as speculation thickened the air. Even a handful of nurses, including Florence Conger, who had witnessed Rachael and Edward tying the knot, had taken the day off just to observe the sentencing. Gerald Thornton was already in place, every inch the media darling he had become in recent weeks. His bespoke suit, sharp cheekbones, and sleek dark hair were framed by his ever-confident smirk. The press had named him Shackles, a prosecutor for whom no conviction ever slipped through his fingers. He had, by all accounts, already won. He wore the look of victory like cologne. Now it was time to deliver the sentence she deserved. The stenographer sat dutifully in her place, fingers twitching above the keys, ready to transcribe what could well be one of the most significant sentencing hearings of the year. She worried daily about being replaced by AI. Rachael sat beside Emmanuel, head bowed. Her braids hung limp around her pale face, the bones of her cheeks far too visible. The weight loss was stark, her puffy eyes bruised from endless nights of tears. She looked hollowed out, more spectre than woman. In contrast, Emmanuel sat upright, calm and composed. The press had already speculated that a life sentence was inevitable now that the death penalty bill lay in ruins. A life for another. Yet one look at Emmanuel's composure wiped the smirk from Gerald's face. Catherine Hale sat in the front row, dressed in a black morning dress tailored to somber perfection. Her back was straight, her chin slightly raised. Grief had carved new lines into her face, aging her by a decade. She looked every bit the grieving mother, dignified yet devastated. Beside her sat Charlotte, subdued, her sorrow more complex. She had witnessed the love between Edward and Rachael, especially on the day Rachael visited him in hospital. It had been real. Whatever had happened, she was no longer certain it had been born of malice. Still, she said nothing. The judge glanced down at his notes, then looked up. "Counselor." Gerald rose with theatrical ease. "Your Honour, before sentencing, the family of the victim has requested to deliver an impact statement." Judge Olam turned to Emmanuel. "Any objections from the defence?" Emmanuel shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honour." Gerald's brow twitched at his composure, but he pressed on. "Then I call Mrs. Catherine Hale." A hush fell as Catherine rose, moving slowly but with dignity, a stack of handwritten pages trembling in her hands. As she approached the podium, Rachael lifted her head for the first time. Their eyes met briefly. Rachael's brimmed with tears. She was desperate for forgiveness. She understood what Catherine had lost. She could not imagine losing a child. But Catherine did not return the gaze. She stood before the microphone and began softly. "Your Honour, ladies and gentlemen of the court, if you had told me at the start of the year that I would be standing here giving this statement, I would have laughed, or cried, or both." Her voice quivered, but she pressed on. "My son Edward was not just a name, not just another headline. He was kind, gentle, thoughtful. He rang me most days, even if just to check I was okay. We had dinner every week, either at mine or our favorite restaurant. He took care of me after his father passed away." She swallowed hard, forcing herself forward. "Who will call me now? Who will remind me to take my blood pressure pills or help me deal with the tax man? Who wants to have dinner with a lonely widow?" Her voice faltered, but grief hardened into steel. "He gave everything to people. To this woman," she gestured without looking at Rachael, "who he believed in, and I cannot understand why. He gave her everything, and in return, she took his life." The courtroom shifted uneasily as she straightened. I want the court to give her the maximum sentence the law allows. She took a life. Let her pay with a lengthy sentence." Rachel flinched, hands instinctively moving to her bump as the baby stirred. Catherine turned and walked back to her seat. The courtroom absorbed the weight of her words. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. "Does the prosecution have any further statements?" "No, Your Honor," Gerald replied. The judge turned to the defense. "Does your client wish to speak?" Emmanuel rose slowly. "Your Honor, I have one final statement to make on her behalf." "You may proceed." He stepped forward without notes. "This will be brief. My client has been found guilty of taking the life of one of London's finest. She is deeply sorry. She regrets the moment she raised her hand against Edward Hale, and she must bear responsibility." The courtroom stirred as he paused, glancing once at Gerald, then at Rachel, before fixing his gaze on the judge. "But I was pierced for Rachael Brown's transgressions. I was crushed for her iniquities. The punishment that brought her peace was laid upon me. The sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary because payment was made at the cross. I ask that Rachael Brown be released on the basis that payment has already been made in full." A furious noise erupted. "Objection!" Gerald snarled. "She is guilty and must pay." The gavel struck. "Order!" Emmanuel returned to his seat. Gerald seethed. Judge Olam turned to Rachel. "May the defendant please rise." Emmanuel steadied her as she stood. The judge regarded her carefully. "This court finds you guilty. The impact of your actions has been profound. The pain caused is immeasurable." He glanced toward Catherine and Charlotte. "The wages of sin is death. There must be accountability." A pause followed, heavy and absolute. "However, mercy and justice must walk together." He returned his gaze to Rachel. Fresh tears streamed down her face, different now. It was not despair, but release. "By the letter of the law and the atoning sacrifice already made, Rachael Brown, you are free to go." The gavel fell. "This court is hereby adjourned." Rachel opened her eyes and stared at the wall. She rose slowly, a quiet sense of freedom settled over her. This was what it meant to be free, knowing that Jesus not only loved her, but had paid the ultimate price for her sins. She was no longer chained to guilt or her past mistakes. Whatever awaited her later that day in Judge Olam's courtroom, she would face it free. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished," and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. John 19:30.